For those who may have forgotten, we are in the beginning of Acts chapter 10. We finished off Acts chapter 9 last time we met. So this morning we are in Acts chapter 10 and we're studying the first 16 verses, so verses 1 to 16. So what I will do, as is our custom, I'll read this morning's passage, we'll pray, and then we'll begin our study from there. So, the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 10, verses 1 to 16. At Caesarea there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of what was known as the Italian cohort, a devout man who feared God with all his household, gave alms generously to the people, and prayed continually to God. About the 9th hour of the day, he saw clearly in a vision an angel of God come in and say to him, "Cornelius." And he stared at him in terror and said, "What is it, Lord?" And he said to him, "Your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God. And now send men to Joppa and bring one Simon who is called Peter. He is lodging with one Simon, a tanner, whose house is by the sea." When the angel who spoke to him had departed, he called 2 of his servants and a devout soldier from among those who attended him, and having related everything to them, he sent them to Joppa. The next day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up on the housetop about the 6th hour to pray. And he became hungry and wanted something to eat. But while they were preparing it, he fell into a trance and saw the heavens opened and something like a great sheet descending, being let down by its 4 corners upon the earth. In it were all kinds of animals and reptiles and birds of the air. And there came a voice to him, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean." And the voice came to him once again, the second time, saying, "What God has made clean, do not call common." This happened 3 times, and the thing was taken up at once to heaven. Let us pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. So, we are in a subdivision of what will naturally string together over the coming weeks. The bulk of this chapter is dedicated to the events surrounding Cornelius and other such things with Peter and his conversion, the conversion of the household and baptism, so on and so forth. And then more broadly, the chapter as a whole is about this big demarcation point between what we've had in the first 9 chapters and the direction that we're now shifting into regarding the conversion of the Gentiles. And so there'll be overflow and overlap between each of the given weeks here. This morning's is, as we've read, dedicated to the first 16 verses. So some context. We are in the year 40 AD. Okay, so we're roughly speaking a decade now after the ascension of Christ. And keeping in mind that it is 10 years afterwards, it gives us an idea of where we put this transition to the Gentiles in the broader scope of church history. A lot of the details here that are kind of just referenced in passing we'll explain, of course. But nevertheless, it's an important turning point in the book of Acts and in the history of the church generally. There will be a bit of a callback to previous chapters, particularly the one regarding the conversion of the Ethiopian eunuch. For those who happen to remember our exegesis there, I did mention that how we are to understand that chapter would depend on how we understand this chapter, and that'll become a bit clearer as we go through. So nevertheless, let's begin in verse 1 and we'll commence from there. So, at Caesarea. Now this is Caesarea Maritima, not Philippi. This is the one where, for those of you who still have those maps and the different photos I rendered of the kind of the current archaeological remains of the place. This is Caesarea Maritima by the sea, not the Philippi inland up on the road to Damascus, where Christ proclaimed, upon this rock, i.e. the rock that Christ is Lord, I'll build my church. It's kind of where we left off essentially from chapter 9, at least in broad detail. And so Caesarea Maritima, this is the one by the sea. To refresh your memory, it was a very recent city that had been built very lavishly by Herod the Great, about 30-ish plus years roughly before this. So it's a relatively new city. And so it explains why we have Roman soldiers there. It explains why there was enough for an entire cohort, and again we'll explain those details in a second, to be stationed in Caesarea Maritima. So at Caesarea there was a man named Cornelius who was a centurion of what was known the Italian cohort. Other translations might say italic. That's just simply the Latin rendering of Italian. So as a centurion, which was a rank in the Roman army, he was in command of what we call a century or a cohort. In this case, he's actually over the top of a cohort. As a centurion, ironically, the centuries by this particular point were only about 80, not 100. They were 100 originally. They were usually 80 by this point, after some restructuring that came in after the days of Augustus and some of his military reforms. So a century was not quite 100 at this particular point, but it was originally, hence the name. And so this is just the different structures of the Roman army. Now, as a centurion, he would have been in, it depends on what time frame, he would have been in for most likely 10 years. He may have been in for as little as 5, but that's highly unlikely. Usually centurions had to have undergone about 10 years of military service to have reached the rank of centurion. Ancient armies, and in fact most armies around the world in history, are not like ours in the modern day, where you go and do a year or 18 months at a military college and somehow pop out as a lieutenant in charge of 30 guys. You actually had to have been in the military for more than 5 minutes, and actually had to have usually had battle experience. So the officers of the Roman military were not rookies. They were the battle-hardened warriors who had been in for a long time. And as I said, for a centurion, usually it was at least 10 years. To put this in perspective, again, it's building our understanding of who Cornelius was and why his conversion is important. By this particular point, 40 AD, if I'm not mistaken, the reforms I might need to go back and check, but the reforms would have already come in, where mandatory military service for someone who did enlist would be 25 years. By this point, I think that had already come in. And so the military was not just simply in for a couple of years and get a trade degree and off you go. It was a lifelong, or at least a career-long dedication to Rome. And his Italian cohort, you'll notice there, he was a centurion of what was known as the Italian cohort. This was the Italica cohort of a greater legion, I believe the 15th legion. I would need to go back and have a look at what specific generation it was from. Yes, it was. So the Italica Civium Romanum. So these guys were, again, stationed here far away from Italy. Now, the reason why you say that it has written there the Italian cohort is to, again, Luke's identifying who he is and, more importantly, who his troops are. So these were not locals, at least not this particular cohort. Often what would occur in the Roman military is that the Roman army as a whole, as a institution, as a sort of machine, was not just purely made up of Romans, like as in actual Italian Romans. At least about a third of the entire Roman military were what were called auxiliaries. which were essentially, let's just say, so one of the most utilised were the Thracians, so those from Thrace, beyond northern Greece. So when the Romans, say, conquered Greece, they would enlist native or indigenous troops, warriors, into the Roman army and as an auxiliary. They would attach them on, right? So it kept them usually from rebelling because they would be fighting for Rome, not against it. It would give them stable income and land and resources, which again would suppress any kind of idea of revolution or rebellion. And that would be the case here as well. So in Syria, which is this broader province in which we are up in Caesarea Maritima, you would have had native Syrian warriors attached to the Roman army as auxiliaries. The reason why Luke here is identifying that he's of the Italian cohort, so this cohort being 500 roughly, is a constituent element of the broader legion, which was usually around 5,000 troops. So that's what it constitutes a legion. So when you hear of the Roman legions, that's usually at one point 5,000, sometimes down to about 3,500. But nevertheless, he's identifying that these are Italians. These are guys from Italy. Does that make sense? Okay. They're italics, i.e. Latins, i.e. Romans. Roman Romans, not just Romans because they're underneath the Roman Empire. So that's why he's highlighting this, okay? So he's highlighting his ethnic background. They've been stationed here in Caesarea Maritima, in the province of in the province of Syria, but they're not locals. They've been stationed from Italy itself, from the Italian peninsula, okay? So he's highlighting his ethnicity because that's an important constituent element, okay? He's not like, now the question is why, okay? We've had plenty of encounters with people who were from somewhere that wasn't Jerusalem or somewhere that wasn't even Judea, right? Going all the way back to the first opening chapters, right? Pentecost, you had a whole swath load of ethnic Jews who weren't from Jerusalem, okay, converted at Pentecost. A sizable percentage of that initial flood of conversions into the Church of Jerusalem were from all those places that were listed. You may recall they were from Cyrene, they were from Alexandria, they were from Rome, they were from Corinth. All around the place that we had that list of places, even beyond to the east in the Parthian Empire. They were from all around the traps, but they were still ethnic Jews. Okay, referred to by the place they were from, like they were referred to as a Cyrene or they were referred to as an Alexandrian. That's an important point that comes up in this text in regards to our understanding of it. But they were nevertheless ethnic Jews. Okay. What we have, even in the last couple of chapters 8 and 9, we've seen this mission go out, right, as the church essentially dispersed under the persecution of Saul. What we then ended up having was now going out to other places up near Damascus and so on and so forth. But that's all still Jews in and around Judea. Okay? This is a really obvious, like blindingly obvious attempt on Luke's part here successfully to identify these are not Jews. They're not Jews. And they're not even just local Syrians. They're actual Romans. They're Italians. That's important, okay, because it impacts how we then exegete the text and how we understand its place, not just in Acts, but in the broader canon, okay? So, Cornelius, as a centurion, he's in authority over obviously century, and he's part of the Italian cohort. One thing to understand as well, I'll read through and then I'll come back to it. So, verse 2. He was a devout man who feared God with all his household, gave alms generously to the people, and prayed continually to God. Now, we'll dissect those three different things in a second, but the first thing is household. So in regards to his household, now, as a officer of the Roman army, he would have his own house, he would have his own residence that would be identified for him, his family and his household. We also need to understand what that constitutes. So a household, not just in this day, but in days generally, is not just the kind of small nuclear family idea that we tend to utilize in the modern day, where it's just 2 parents, 2 kids and the dog with the house and the white picket fence. Okay? Household would have included himself, obviously wife, children, potentially if they were adults, we don't know what age they were, but children of various ages, no matter what age, youngest to oldest. It would have included potentially other relatives that also would have moved over with him as well. And then most importantly, it also definitely included anyone who worked in that household, so all of his servants, right? And the degree of servanthood, when you think servant, generally default to slave, more times than not. Local Italian, again, their identity is not, their ethnic identity is not necessarily mentioned. You would assume that they also would be Italian, because generally speaking, this would be a big move, right? His entire household, he wouldn't have acquired this when he got to Caesarea Maritima. This would have come over with him. A reason why we know that is because we actually know that a bit more about his identity beyond just simply the mentioning of him being an Italian. He was from a very prominent gens, a family, from the gens Cornelia, which is where his name comes from, Cornelius. His first name would not have been Cornelius. This is technically actually his family name. It's kind of how we refer commonly. If I start talking about Caesar, generally speaking, people will know I'm talking about Julius Caesar, right? But even the name Julius Caesar wasn't his first name, right? So Julius Caesar's full name, Gaius Julius Caesar, is his full name. Gaius is like Daniel, and then the transition would be Julius is like Thomas. Julius was his surname, if you want to think of it that way. And then Caesar is actually what's called a cognomen, but I won't bore you with the details of that, right? But Julius Caesar, as we think of him, wasn't like Daniel Thomas. It would be like if I had a by-name or a particular name that identified what part of the Thomas family I was from. Let's just say that was the Smith. I'm just going to use something random, right? It'd be like my name was Daniel Thomas Smith. Part of the gens Thomas, the Thomas clan of the branch of Smith. This is how Roman names worked. More importantly, getting back to Cornelius, he was of the gens Cornelia, which was a very, very, very prominent family or clan in the history of Rome, just as prominent as the Julian clan. It's why Julius Caesar was in the position to be in the position that he was in, because he wasn't just some nobody from the countryside. He was from an extremely wealthy, high nobility family, as was Cornelius. Right? His name, Cornelius, is because he's part of the gens Cornelia. So a lot of resources, very prominent, easily by a country mile the wealthiest person we've encountered thus far, and probably the single wealthiest person ever mentioned in the New Testament by a country mile, because of the prominence of the gens or the family of the Cornelians. Extremely famous family in the history of Rome. Also informs why he's a centurion, why he's in the army. This would have been a duty. There wouldn't have been a question. This Cornelius would have been born and raised to become a warrior and to end his time in the military after 25 years and probably go into the Senate, into the Roman Senate as a politician. So these kinds of contextual details inform what's going on here. Okay, it informs why he has a household, and again, the extent of his household was everyone who not just was part of his own genetic family, but, as has been the common definition of a household throughout history, also all those who worked and operated in the household. Okay, so all the servants were always considered part of the household. That's been the case up until really not that long ago. And by that I mean, like, literally, that transition is essentially only in the last 100 years. You can go back to the Edwardian era, back in the early 1900s, so 1900 to 1910, and the concept of what constituted a household, say particularly in Britain, was the family, as well as all the servants who worked below and who lived in the housing and who worked as housemaids or as ladies' maids or as butlers or footmen and so on and so forth. Right? That constituted household. It informs how we understand this text. So there's 3 things that are listed here in verse 2. He was a devout man who feared God with all his household. He gave alms generously to the people, ALMS, not alms, but alms, and prayed continually to God. So let's break that down. So he's a devout man who feared God. This is not just a generic reference to fearing God. This is a title and virtue actually being ascribed to him by Luke here. That of a God-fearer. So, what is a God-fearer? A God-fearer, by biblical definition, is one who is not a Jew, so they're not ethnically Jewish. They're not a proselyte, so in other means they haven't converted to, like that you had instances like, say, like Ruth, for example, right? So conversion into Israel, and obviously for the man that would have constituted circumcision. This is someone who, as the text suggests, fears the God of Israel, worships the God of Israel, has been taught the scriptures of the God of Israel, but hasn't been circumcised and brought into the covenant community. Okay, that's essentially the simple definition. There are God-fearers throughout the Old Testament that come up every now and then, but God-fearer is a generic biblical term for one who, kind of as the name suggests, fears, respects, and worships the God of Israel, right, the true God, but who isn't considered a proselyte or a convert in, right? So he wouldn't have been circumcised, none of his family would have been, none of his household, in other words, would have been. But you can see the kind of actions that being he's not just called a God-fearer, he's a devout man who feared God. Like you'll see throughout this text, like Luke's really laying this on thick here for the purpose of what's going on. You're explaining what then happens with Peter and so on. So he's a devout man who is a God-fearer, right? So someone who feared, honoured and worshipped the one true God, but wasn't a, on paper, convert into the covenant community through circumcision. And that explains then his actions. He gave alms, right? He gave charity to the people generously. So that would be obviously usually in the form of finance, resources, all the above, right? And prayed continually to God. So he prayed actively, right? So it wasn't just a mere kind of, tip of the cap. It was actually an observable devotion, right? So he's listing that he was a devout man who feared God, and here's how we know that. He gave alms and prayed continually. That's what Luke's doing, essentially. Does that make sense? So he's demonstrating this is a glowing review on Luke's part, okay? Really like laying it out very, very clearly and generously as to who he was, and the fact that he worshipped God, but was not considered a convert, okay, aka a proselyte or a convert, who had been circumcised and brought into the covenant community as a Jew in that sense, okay? So verse 3, that'll come up with more relevance later. So verse 3, about the 9th hour of the day, I know I've explained this before, but again, the day begins at the rising of the sun, so roughly speaking 6 a.m. So the 9th hour of the day is then going to be 3 p.m, okay? We encounter that same reference later on in verse 9 to the 6th hour, which would be noon, okay? So the 9th hour, counting from 6 a.m, 3 p.m. That might seem unimportant. It's not. The reason why he's doing that is for the simple reason that it wasn't nighttime. Why would that be relevant? Because what happens is he clearly sees a vision. Okay, so why would he be bothering to point that out? Because he's pointing out this isn't a dream. Okay, this is not a dream. This is clearly a vision, and you'll notice that visions as distinct from dreams aren't given during the night as a general rule of thumb. Okay, virtually any time you encounter, you may think of obviously pretty famous examples of dreams as like Daniel, for example, right? Many of the night dreams and the night terrors, those are dreams during the night, but visions that occur are during the day. They're a distinct category from dreams. Okay, so visions and dreams are not the same thing. The main distinguishing feature is that visions happen during the day, dreams happen during the night, right? And it's pretty hard to miss a vision during the day. There's right. There's something that seems fairly obvious, but it's highlighting. He's highlighting here that this wasn't just merely the machinations of Cornelius's mind. This was a really obvious dream that happened during the day. Okay, that's why he says, and he saw clearly in a vision. All right, and so what does he see at 3 p.m. in a clear vision? He sees an angel of God come in, presuming coming into the house, and he says to him, Cornelius. And he stared at him in terror, which I guess you could draw the point. I guess you could also draw the point there that even a battle-hardened Roman warrior will be drawn still in terror and fear at the sight of an angel. And if that happens to a battle-hardened Roman warrior at the sight of an angel, what on earth do you think is going to happen when you stand before God? That's usually a good evangelistic point to draw to people. Or anyone who would rather treat God with irreverency or with flippancy, is that most people would collapse into a heap of goo over the sight of an angel. What on earth do you think will happen when you face the one who created every single one of them? And this I imagine, just to make it more palatable and more logistically appropriate, so that Cornelius didn't die in the presence. We often find that these angelic visitations are in a form that is relatable. Again, this would be an angel appearing in a human-like form to make it so that Cornelius' brain could still function, not how they appear elsewhere, like say in the Revelation of John, where you see these angelic beings in ways that just look like a complete acid trip. If we used, we're familiar with angels used in paintings and Christian artwork, which is fine because they do appear in human form at many different junctures. But if we often portrayed them in the way that they are portrayed elsewhere, like in Isaiah's vision in chapter 6, or in John's vision in Revelation chapter 4, and we portrayed them in our churches, we would probably be accused of paganism. The reality here is that this angel appearing to him is, again, not the one who is to be honoured or worshipped. He is pointing towards the one who is, which is what the angelic messenger's job is. Again, the angelos means messenger. That's what it means from the Greek. He says to him, Cornelius. And so having stared at him in terror, Cornelius says, what is it, Lord? Now, keep in mind, this is not the use of the employment of the word Kyrios here in the Greek is not used in the way that we apply the term Kyrios to God. This would be applying it in the generic sense, right? So he would have been referred to as Kyrios in one sense, at least by his servants in the household, right? It's just simply my Lord, meaning the one who is over me, right? The one in charge. So immediately he recognizes that this is someone or something that is above him, and so the Lord. This is not some blasphemous. When you see the word Lord here, don't think it's a blasphemous reference. It's the generic reference of Kyrios. You could also potentially stretch. Some do, and it's not a wildly out of place interpretation. But some theologians would argue that the reference to Kyrios is a reference to God as God speaking through the angel, which in one sense is occurring, right? The angel is but a messenger of God. The angel doesn't say a single word out of place. He only says what God has instructed him to say. So he may be referring to Lord as in referring to God vicariously through the angel, which theologically, again, it's not some wild speculative point. But either way, that's whichever interpretation one would take, that's all it is. So he says, what is it, Lord? And he said to him, your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God. That's fascinating. So your prayers and your alms, in other words, the evidence of your devotion to God, which is what was referenced back in verse 2, the alms and the prayer were listed as the evidence of said devotion mentioned at the beginning of verse 2. Your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God. It's reminiscent of the language from both the Old and the New Testament, to something like incense, for example. Many times throughout the Old Testament, incense was used in the tabernacle, in the temple, symbolizing the prayers ascending to God as sweet aromatic incense, the prayers of his people. Incense is I mentioned it just earlier with Revelation chapter 4, referencing those angels. Incense features in Revelation chapter 4 in this heavenly vision of the heavenly court. Incense, the prayers of God's people, the prayers of the saints, rising before God as incense. It's why incense has been used in churches going way back. So as a very tiny little tidbit, just to throw it in there because I can, incense is not some Roman Catholic perversion of the Christian faith. Incense is something that is profoundly biblical, both Old and New Testament. Just throw that in there. But nevertheless, your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God, as a memorial, as a proverbial honor, as a statue, as before God, as a monument, so to say. And in verse 5, and now send men to Joppa and bring one Simon who is called Peter. The point here, as I thought of it there at the end of verse 4, the point of why he mentions that at the top, your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God, is showing that those prayers and alms were accepted by God. In contrast, there are prayers and alms or good works of various kinds that do not ascend and are not accepted, or they may ascend but they're not accepted. The idea that of God's omniscience, and of the fact that he is all-knowing, and of course obviously does hear someone when they pray, no matter who they are, by virtue of his omniscience, that doesn't mean that prayer is accepted. So when you see, for example, and doesn't happen all the time, but there are plenty of references in the Old Testament particularly of God not hearing the prayers of da-da-da-da, right? It's not because his omniscience is failing. No, it's a point being drawn that when they say he does not hear their prayers, it's a willingly not listening and acting upon that prayer. It's language used to say that they're not accepted. Okay, and that goes for the works too. And he mentions prayers and alms. So your charity, your giving, right, was not just pure ritualism, right? It wasn't blind obedience. It was, in fact, generated from faith. Okay, as opposed to works that are simply done but aren't pleasing to God.
Sweet aroma amount goes up to God.
Yes. Exactly right, 100%. It's like, for example, why Isaiah mentions on more than one occasion, right? Works being like filthy rags, right? They count for nothing, right? Again, because all kinds of scenarios like that. And so simply doing good work. This is just one little piece of the broader puzzle that informs us that works don't save. No. Because ironically, even though this is used as a proof text by, say, the Church of Rome, for example, as to why it's demonstrating that, it actually, in fact, in the broader council, demonstrates exactly the opposite of what they think it's demonstrating. It demonstrates that the prayers and the alms are accepted or rejected by God based upon something that must be beyond the prayers and the alms. Okay? So the mere praying and the mere giving of charity or alms can't itself be the thing that somehow works in terms of salvation, because all you'd have to do is just do that and it would then work. What it means is there must be some other, not necessarily supplementary, but almost foundational component that legitimizes the prayers and the works. And what must that be? The indication is faith. Because what did this entire thing begin with in verse 2? A devout man. who feared God. Do you see? So ironically, even though it's commonly cited by some as a proverbial proof text for why sola fide, right, salvation or justification being of faith alone, is erroneous, that view that's taken, this is used as one of many other texts that's used the proof text. Ironically, this demonstrates that it must actually be only by faith, because otherwise you can't have alms and prayers that are accepted but others that aren't. Something else must be determining which ones are or are not accepted. Yes, the element of faith, right? The element of devotion, is what that's saying there, must be the factor that distinguishes between prayers/works that are accepted versus prayers/works that are not accepted. It has to, if they're all the same, if one does faith, one does prayer and works, another does prayer works, but these ones are accepted, these ones aren't, then something beyond the prayers and the works must be drawing the distinction between why these ones are accepted and these ones aren't. Do you see how that works? Yeah? Okay. So upon that instruction, in verse 5, the angel then gives a command. Now send men to Joppa and bring one Simon who is called Peter. He is lodging with one Simon, a tanner, whose house is by the sea. Now that's where we ended up at the end of at the end of chapter 9, was with Peter lodging with Simon the tanner. Okay. And I said to you last time, I said that will become important when we get to chapter 10. I gave a very brief explanation of why that was the case last time we met in our last study session. Was by virtue of, again, a tanner, that's not a Jewish occupation, right? The working with dead animal carcasses is not something that was at all kosher. And I said to you last time that wasn't inserted just by accident or just as a passing detail. It was something that would become relevant because it informs the very vision that he then has, right? So we'll get into that in a minute. So in verse 7, when the angel who spoke to him had departed, he is in Cornelius. Cornelius called 2 of his servants and a devout soldier from among those who attended him. And having related everything to them, he sent them to Joppa. Now that would have been a fascinating conversation with 2 of his servants and a devout soldier. Yeah. All right, guys. So here's the deal. So I just had an angel vision me, and he just said that. Now I want you to go to this city Joppa, and apparently you'll find a guy called Simon who's called Peter there, and he's at the house of another Simon, not the same Simon, but a different Simon who's a tanner.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But that's what we're told, all right? So he sends these 3, servants, in this case slaves, but the 3 servants of Israel, so 2 servants and a soldier. Yeah. The soldier would have been to protect the servants, on their way to go and find Peter and to obey the commands given. Now, I'll draw it more directly in a minute or later on when we get towards the end of it. But I just want you to take a very brief mental note of the clarity of obedience on the part of Cornelius. Angel appears, like vision, angel appears, what is it, Lord? Showing he's prepared to listen. Receives the commendation and then the command or the instruction, and then immediately obeys, sends out the whatever. Just put a pin in that mental note for a sec. So let's continue. Verse 9. The next day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, again, this is the city down in Joppa, right? Peter went up on the housetop about the 6th hour to pray. So again, 6th hour would be noon. It's clear when you study the broader canon of the New Testament, prayers were conducted 3 times a day, morning, noon, and evening prayers. That was a habit and a custom, very prevalent in the early church, very prevalent in the medieval church, prevalent in the Reformation church, and has been prevalent for the majority of Protestantism up until the last couple of decades, kind of thing. And that's all I'll say about that. But he's going up onto the housetop. Now, what does that mean? It houses in the Levant, in Middle East, or in the Eastern Mediterranean generally. had livable rooftops, right? Flat rooftops. They're not terraced rooftops and other such things like we have these days, but flat rooftops that would be living spaces that people would often sleep on top of the roofs, because again it was generally cooler in the night with the evening breeze. Those were almost always accessible by an external staircase on the side of the house, and so it was a functioning living space. And so he's gone up to the rooftop to pray, as well as probably to eat something after prayer, like eat something for lunch. We know that because again in verse 10 it mentioned that he became hungry in verse 10 and wanted something to eat. Okay, that's important because it informs the vision as well, right? That wasn't coincidental. So he's hungry and wanted something to eat, but while they were preparing it, so while the family or the servants, whoever happened to be there at the house at Joppa with Simon the tanner, were preparing that meal, he fell into a trance and saw the heavens open and something like a great sheet descending, being let down by its four corners upon the earth. So there's a couple of things there, so let's break that down. So, trance. I'd be interested to see what word they're using there for trance. What were verse number, end of 10. So, yeah, I thought so. Ecstasis. So it's where we get the English word via the Latin ecstasy. Not necessarily the drug, but ecstasy as in a state of ecstasy. So going into a trance, this is again indicating it's similar kind of language. This is not a dream in the night. This is like the vision that Cornelius has. So there's a parallelism going on here between Cornelius and Peter, if that makes sense, right? He's gone into a trance. He's gone into a fugue-like state, so to speak, where he then has this vision in this trance. Okay. Again, that's why he's highlighted it's at the 6th hour. He's paralleling the same kind of thing. Yet Luke mentioned the time, 9th hour, and that he had a vision. The time, 6th hour, and he goes into a trance. It's showing the same kind of experience, broadly speaking, right? Except he doesn't have an angelic messenger visit him in this state. He sees this ecstatic vision, ecstatic literally in that sense, of ecstasis. So what does he say? Verse 11. He saw the heavens opened up. So again, it's saying the heavens, it's using in the more common definition of the word heavens, the skies above, the heavens above. The heavens open up to him, and something like a great sheet descending. Again, a sheet, think like a bed sheet. Something like a great sheet descending, being let down by its four corners upon the earth. Now again, the four corners reference, I'll come back to that in a minute. Verse 12, in it were all kinds of animals and reptiles and birds of the air. The point of why this is being highlighted is, particularly when you come to words like reptiles and birds of the air, this is very, Luke trying to clearly articulate, and this would have been understood immediately by the original audiences. This is animals both clean and unclean. Now, what do I mean by that? This is referring back to the Holiness Code, the Levitical Code, particularly Leviticus chapter 11, of the Holiness Code of what was considered ritually clean and unclean, which was a lengthy legal code outlined mainly in Leviticus, and particularly Leviticus chapter 11, of animals that were not unclean, to keep it in regards to the animals that could be kept, handled, touched, eaten, the whole box and dice. Reptiles and birds of the air, generally speaking, when birds of the air gets used, particularly in the Hebrew context, it's usually, not exclusively, but usually in terms of the majority of the time, being used as a kind of shorthand reference to scavenger birds. Yeah. Okay, vultures, ravens, etc., etc. Right? Carry on, blah blah. The animals that scavenge, animals that feast off flesh. That's generally what birds of the air get referenced as. It's also partly by the way why, again, symbolically or metaphorically, demonic powers get referred to as principalities or powers of the air. It's a symbolic reference in connection to birds like vultures and ravens. It wasn't lost. Obviously, it meant something different to give you one example, it meant something different to the Vikings. So Norse cultures, like the Norwegians, the Danes, the Swedes in medieval times, the raven was a popular image for reasons that were specific to them. But it wasn't lost on the Anglo-Saxons, right? The English, for example, that these pagan Northmen who were invading them bore a raven banner. The raven was a symbol of Odin, the one who was the primary deity in Germanic mythology, the one who was referred to as the All-Father. And it wasn't lost on the English that these pagan Northmen, as I said, were bearing a raven banner. Again, ravens and other such things have usually, not always, but usually been a symbol of dark forces, or at least at a minimum death, because they would feast upon dead corpses. So referencing of reptiles and birds of the air is a reference to clean and unclean animals. So there were all kinds of animals on this sheet that was descending, okay, in this vision. That's the important point to understand. Verse 13 in connection, and there came a voice to him, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." Now before I explain that, this is another example, just to connect something to something I mentioned on Sunday. I mentioned about imperatives. If you recall on Sunday, I mentioned about the concept of an imperative, i.e. a command. So the word rise is in what we call the imperative form, right? It's rise, it's an instruction, it's a command, just like praise was on Sunday, yeah? Rise in the imperative form. It would be in the masculine verbal form as well, because it's referring to Peter. So rise, Peter, kill and eat. This is a command, it's not a suggestion. It's an instruction and a command. Rise, Peter, kill and eat, right? Kill the animals you see before you and partake of them, eat of them. Now, this is where I told you to put a pin in Cornelius's reaction of hearing, yes, does it. In typical Petrine fashion, but Peter said, that would I imagine that there may have been some who were tempted to put that on his cenotaph or tombstone. Here lies the Apostle Peter, and then in quotations, but Peter said, almost as his life statement, because the amount of times that we've had where Peter hears an instruction and decides to ask a clarifying question, which is the generous way of putting it. This is one such example. But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean." Now, whilst that's noble and virtuous, that's not what he said to you. He said to you to arise, to kill and to eat. But, yeah, jump in.
When, in one of the Gospels, or more than one, when Zechariah, father of John the Baptist, failed to obey Gabriel,
Correct, yeah.
he was struck with
He was silenced, literally and figuratively.
muteness.
Yeah.
Why isn't Peter disciplined
Yeah.
here?
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, no, it's a good question though.
He did both disobeyed.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's and that I'll circle back to it once I get to the end of it. It's a very valid point. Verse 15, and the voice came to him again a second time. What God has made clean, do not call common. This happens 3 times, and the thing was taken up to heaven at once. Now, I'm sure when it says that it was taken up to heaven, now the thing was taken up to heaven at once, it would just be explaining the conclusion of the vision. a cynical theologian might say that was the angel or God just going, oh, for goodness sake, and just taking it away. But I'm not that cynical. But make no mistake, Luke's very pointed inclusion of this happened 3 times. So in other words, the second, well, it would technically be the third questioning back or rejection or whatever you want to refer to it as, doesn't get referenced. He just simply explains, and it happened 3 times. It's a very purposeful demonstration, or it's meant to be. It's a very purposeful hearkening back, calling back to the triple denial of Peter.
And if you think about that, he doesn't go, I've done this once before.
Yeah, I'm sure it. Yeah.
Behaviour.
Yeah. Now I know it comes next week, but the verse 17 does say, now while Peter was inwardly perplexed as to what the vision may have meant, behold, the men arrive. Like again, so he was perplexed and confused by it. It's kind of showing an interesting distinction. Not necessarily in a negative sense. It's not so much meant to be negatively reflecting on Peter. It's more meant to be positively reflecting on Cornelius. Does that make sense? It's not meant to be like, Peter. Like it's not meant to be like. It's not meant to be a negative highlighting of Peter. It's meant to be a positive highlighting of Cornelius in light of Peter's reaction. It's more this way than that way. Okay, but this is mirroring his triple denial back from the Gospels, and very intentionally. Because what it's doing, and here's the broader point, because this is where we now start to get into the bit more of the meta exegesis, which I'll touch on, but I want to refer to one other thing here regarding the food as well. Is it's actually showing, it's meant to be highlighting Cornelius in light of the one who's referred to as the chief of the apostles. Okay, we'll circle back to that because that's the meta interpretation. Let me just highlight some more things about the animals here that are really important. What on earth is the point of this whole, of the animals and all this kind of business? It's midday, lunchtime, inverted commas. He's up on the rooftop. He's hungry. He's having food prepared. So then a vision comes about food, inherently connected to it. Yeah, inherently connected to it. What you have, as I explained earlier, is you have clean and unclean animals. Animals of all kinds that would have been considered regarding the Levitical Holy Code as clean and unclean, descending down upon the earth. And Luke makes a point of referencing the fact that this sheet with all these animals is descending upon the 4 corners of the earth, right? Upon its 4 corners upon the earth. Again, which is very similar to the reference that we get many times to the 4 corners of the earth. No, they didn't believe that the earth was literally divided up into 4 corners. The 4 corners was a metaphorical reference to the 4. Yeah, exactly. It's simply an expression, a figure of speech, to the 4 corners of the earth. It being let down by its 4 corners of the earth is a blindingly clear allusion to that phrase or statement, the 4 corners of the earth. Okay, why is that important? What's going on here, and this has been universal understanding. This has been clearly understood at pretty much every single point of church history. This is a reference to, and the whole point of this, we obviously see this explanation further on once we get into next week and the week after kind of thing. So more of it will be revealed unto us. But even at this beginning stage here, this is a reference to a division between those who are clean and unclean, i.e. Jew and Gentile, now being abolished or broken down. Okay, right? The wall. Yeah, the wall. Right. The distinction between Jew and Gentile in terms of ritual cleanness has here been broken. Right, has here been done away with.
So has the ceremonial law regarding actual foodstuffs.
Correct. Yes, and that's been the historic understanding going literally all the way back.
So it couldn't have been the case that the Israelites were refraining from pig flesh for parasites' sake. That's never made sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's if anything, it's a so the same thing goes for things like shellfish and other sorts of things. It would be a byproduct, but it never should be understood that the illegality of pork or shellfish, etc., reptilians, is the primary point was never about protection from infectious disease. That would be a byproduct that you could imagine for sure, but that was the entire point was about specifically what the Holiness Code is referencing here. Anything like that is merely a byproduct. It's the same as it's merely the same way as not mixing, not wearing clothes mixed of different fabrics was not because God was trying to protect their fashion sensibilities, right? It was for a specific ceremonial/ritual point. Okay. So yeah, at best things like that are but a byproduct, and they could have and would have been in one sense, because you notice that a lot of, again, pork, shellfish, carrion, the birds of the air, right? Scavengers. They're all lower on the trophic hierarchy, which is just simply the food chain, and a lot of them are bottom feeders by definition, right? They're eating the carcasses or the wastage of other animals. So that would be part of it, but it's only in a secondary sense. The primary point is ritual, yes. So in the distinction, in the abrogation of the ceremonial, or this particular aspect of the Holiness Code, which is what's going on here, it's for that very point that I just referenced there. The point of the Holiness Code, and specifically in regards to clean and unclean distinctions, was for the broader theological point of the distinction of holiness. It's why it's called the Holiness Code, right? Holiness meaning set apart or to be other, right? Singling out. So it was to create distinction between people of God, people of the nations. The abrogation of that herein, which is what this vision is doing quite clearly, is also abrogating the theological point of that Holiness Code. Okay, so by abrogating the actual letter of the law, it's abrogating the spirit of it. What does that mean? What I mean by that is this. You take away the distinction between clean and unclean foods. It also, by definition, automatically takes away the distinction between clean and unclean people. Okay? It's a breaking down of the distinction between Jew and Gentile in terms of ritual cleanness. Does that make sense? That's why this sheet is coming down upon the four corners, and that allusion to the four corners of the earth, right? It's why he then is instructed, rise, Peter, kill and eat. In other words, partake, right? You can partake of these things now. Ergo, you can also partake of the Gentiles, right? Not in terms of killing and eating them, but in terms of having to do with them, okay?
It's also, I think, a breaking down of the barrier within Judaism of clean and unclean. So that's giving the green light to Jews to go help the lepers and not to cast them out of the city.
Yeah, a number of all those kinds of things. Anything connected to the clean and unclean. Because again, that's what I'm saying. The point of clean and unclean food was not necessarily of the food itself. It was to make the broader theological point of clean and unclean people. Right, so you can't separate the food from the people. If a distinction is made with the food, it's made with the people. That's the point, right? And so that's why that point's accurate, by virtue of the fact that the food is making the point about the people. By abrogating the distinction between the food, you've automatically abrogated the distinction between the people in terms of their ritual cleanness. So yeah, exactly. So observing kosher laws today is distinctly against the commands of God because it violates this passage. Right? So that goes for the kind of the relatively modern or recent revival of what we tend to refer to as the Hebrew Roots movement. So the Hebrew Roots movement is really essentially nothing more than the revival of the Judaizing heresy from Galatia. Those who are referring to themselves as Christians, but who are requiring Saturday Sabbatarian observance, who are requiring adherence to these food distinctions of cleanliness, kosher laws, etc., are if they got a letter from the Apostle Paul, it wouldn't be good. It would read a lot like Galatians.
It's really rather an odd way of the Lord indicating that there's been a change. This vision is very strange. He could have just said so.
Yeah,
He could have just said so.
Yeah, you're right. He could have.
But this is all very strange.
Yes, no, strange is the word. That's why verse 17 says, "Now, why Peter was inwardly perplexed as to what the vision what the vision that he had might mean." This is largely this is actually a useful application of the phrase that the Lord works in mysterious ways, as opposed to the way it gets colloquially referred to. This is actually a legitimate kind of bona fide way of explaining that. Is that you're right? He could just say it, or he could do it this way, and Peter wouldn't forget. This is a pretty memorable way of doing it. You know what I mean?
This is significant for reasons that probably we don't have time to go into.
Yeah.
The Lord could have just decreed it.
Oh, exactly.
Simple.
Yeah, it could have been a very simple decree. That could have been. There are plenty of times like Paul makes decrees. Paul gives plenty of commands in his epistles that are not in some ecstatic vision. They are commands that are given, and by virtue of the fact that he was writing under the inspiration of the Spirit, it's a commandment of God. Right? Could have done it that way.
I think the Lord is indicating to us is that something very mysterious has occurred.
Yes.
And it's clearly of momentous importance because
Very
we're
much
going
so.
from we're transitioning from the Old Testament to the New.
Yes.
It's a mystery.
Yeah, exactly. The Mysterion, yeah, I'm sure.
And it's another thing, the Holy Spirit is opening up to us now.
Yeah, exactly. And that
we're not bound by those regulations.
by the regulations of the Holiness Code, yeah. Exactly. And again, when I say abrogated, understand that I'm using abrogation in a particular way. It's not just merely revoking, like you won't hear me use the word revoking. Abrogated in the sense that they've been fulfilled. Okay, so none of it, again, think
wrong, but
no, 100%, no, exactly right. Yeah. Think not that I have come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Yeah. Now, when fulfillment means completed, that's fulfill in the Greek means completed. There are other words for completed, but in that context, fulfillment in the Greek means completed. Not because, and this is where again the balance, you've raised something there that's important. There is a balance that has to be struck. Something that a lot of places are starting to, it's been going on for 50-something years now probably, but there's a tendency in modern evangelical circles, and unfortunately I would say probably particularly Baptist circles, where a lot of people are walking dangerously close to a very ancient heresy called Marcionism. In very simple terms, Marcionism, named after its Hazaryarch Marcion, whose name was Marcion, the arch-heretic, right, so the one after whom the heresy is named. Marcion, in very simple terms, essentially believed, and this is an oversimplification, but for time's sake, the Old Testament God was different from the New Testament God. The Old Testament God, Yahweh, was a violent, capricious, evil demiurge, but the New Testament God, Christ, kind, benevolent, good, etc. Blah, blah. And that was the story of Christ is Christ's victory or conquest over Yahweh, this Old Testament God. So it was a bifurcation of Old and New Testament, bifurcation of the deities, blah, blah, blah. Very obviously identified as heresy, condemned as heresy inside of 5 minutes. That was it. It had a fiery yet short run. Now, and I'm not saying this lightly, obviously, but a lot of far too many people are flirting way too much with that kind of idea of this bifurcation between the Old and New Testament, and by extension, Old and New Covenant. The amount of times that I, in my lifetime, have heard the statement, "We're not under law, we're under grace," used as a point to basically say the Old Testament law is done away with, now we're under grace. And that's exactly how it's been used, and it gets used all the time, right? If you use the phrase "we're not under law or under grace" to mean what often it does get used to mean in terms of not its biblical usage, but its modern usage of the law has been done away with and now we're under grace, and you're quite literally, you're not just like at Echo Point, like you've literally stepped over the railing and you're like hanging on, leaning over the edge. That's how close you are to Marcionism. Like you're that close. You're that close to heresy. Super duper dangerous.
Unfortunately, that morphs into, in my humble view, once saved, always saved. What you just said.
Depending on how that phrase gets used. It depends on how the phrase gets used, because it can be used in different ways.
Yeah, which further in my humble opinion is a simpleton's argument. Simpleton.
Often can be, but again, it depends on how it's
what
used.
Scripture says. But anyway, that's another story.
Yeah, it depends on how it gets used. Yeah.
I know so many people now who are really talking about you've got to trace your Jewish roots.
That's that Hebrew roots idea, yeah.
Yeah,
No.
this has come in fairly recently.
That's what I said, yeah, it's the last kind of
Yeah.
100-ish
And I
years
think,
plus.
no, I don't.
Negative, 100% wrong, no. It's not. What's fascinating, one of the most fascinating things about the New Testament is just how hard Paul goes against the Judaizers in Galatia. It's really, like he goes hard against the Gnostics in Colossae. So that's why the reason why Colossians spend so much time dealing with Christology, right, so in other words, who is Christ, is because of the Gnostic cult that had first developed there in Colossae, which I've referenced before. But the Judaizers had really got a stronghold in Galatia. He calls them, he refers to them using phrases that if I used that on a Sunday, people would probably raise their eyebrows. Like he uses some really strong terms there. We kind of tend to euphemize it when we translate it into English, but there are some statements he makes there in the Greek which are really blunt. He basically says, again, considering that one of the heresies of the Judaizers was that the fundamental heresy of the Judaizers was, in really simple terms, you have to become a Jew in order to become a Christian. Okay? You have to be, it's like you can only become a Christian via the way of Judaism. You have to become a Jew to become a Christian. It's like go through Jewishness to become Christian, right? That was the heresy. And it was creating literally and figuratively a stumbling block, literally and figuratively, for the Gentiles. Considering that one of the things they were demanding that you had to get circumcised first, so in other words, become a Jew, then become a Christian. We euphemize it in the English a bit, but what he really bluntly says in the Greek is, I wish they would quite literally cut off their genitals. That's what I wish they would do. That's what Paul says. It's in the canon of the New Testament. That means that's what God says. Yeah. So think about how serious. That's God saying that he wishes that these heretics would castrate themselves, would literally cut off their genitals, which would result in them bleeding to death. That's how serious he thought that was, and thinks to this day. So Hebrew roots notions make someone like me very nervous. Not like in terms of it taking over, it's not. But in terms of like people getting drawn in, because it has the facade or the appearance of being like, oh yeah, get back to the early church, blah, blah, the Old Testament's all, that's Hebrew stuff, blah, blah, blah. So it seems like...
Jesus was a Jew, they say.
Yes, and he was, yeah.
And then they add, and he still is, and I think, I never think of my Jesus as being Gentile
or Jewish or either way, yeah. No, but that's the broad point, is because the distinction there.
I didn't know what was going on.
Yeah.
So much.
Yeah. Well, it's mainly an American phenomenon, primarily. But it has, correct. But it has it's broadened a lot more. It's taken particular root among African Americans, but yeah. Either way, it's nothing more. It's kind of it's the quasi resurrection of the Judaizer heresy from Galatia and from elsewhere that should be avoided at all possible costs.
And the circumcision of the heart then is ignored. because
Correct.
it's emphasized.
Yeah, or it's at least put on the back burner. It takes a back seat to that. Yeah, and because if you're going to if you're going to try and take a new convert from Japan and try and trace their Hebrew roots, you're going to be there for a while because it's non-existent, right? So it makes no sense. What it's doing is it's elevated. It's literally I'm saying to you, it's exactly the same thing. It's elevating Jewishness, as in like ethnically. It's elevating Jewish ethnicity to a level that the New Testament doesn't give it. This is flattened out. This is not put in a hierarchy. Right? This is the very problem. This is why the day, if you call back from Acts chapter 7, I believe it was, with the institution of the diaconate to the deacons in Jerusalem, what was the entire point of that? Why did that occur? Does anyone remember? What was the issue over? No, that's right. What was happening was you had, again, they're all ethnically Jews, but you had the Hellenistic Jews, i.e. Jews not from Jerusalem, who didn't speak Hebrew, being cheated out of food and resources for their widows, where it was all going, or the majority of it was going, disproportionately and unfairly, to the Hebrew-speaking Jews, to the Jews from Jerusalem. So there was inequality and balance. The Hebrew-speaking Jews were being elevated and put above their non-Hebrew-speaking Jewish counterparts in the one church. And that was a big, serious issue. That's why the diaconate was instituted. So you had an entire office of the church instituted to resolve a food distribution issue. That's why Paul goes so hard against the Judaizers in Galatia, because now this is over how a Gentile becomes a Christian in the first place. No. And this extends even more broadly in other ways that one may not think of immediately and obviously. This is why one of the fundamental problems of the Church of Rome is its imperious use of, or its imperial use, I should say, of Latin. Demanding that, which they've reverted back from largely or increasingly since Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council in 1965. But up until 1965, it didn't matter where on earth you went, the service was conducted in Latin. None of these people speak Latin. You're sitting here in Brazil. None of these people speak Latin. I know it's a Romance language, Portuguese, but none of them speak Latin. They have no idea what's being said, other than whatever familiar phrases or words that they've kind of gotten used to from hearing. Yeah, but you're using a foreign language when none of them understand it. So for starters, you're already violating the commandments again with regards to tongues in 1 Corinthians 12, where there must be a translator. That's point number one. So like you'll never hear me reference some phrase in Latin or Greek, which I do all the time, in Hebrew, but without telling you what it means. But that's that same kind of concept. You're elevating Latin, even as a Gentile language, to a status where it now overrides the native languages of the people whom you are serving. That's what happened in the English Reformation. Latin went out the window and they started doing it in English, which was a good thing. It must be done in the native language. I don't want a church service in China to be happening in English. That's wrong. Don't do it in English. No, don't do it in English. You do it in Mandarin, because that's what they speak. If you're at a place, don't get me wrong. If you're at a place where if you're at a place like, so for example, like there are some good churches in Dubai in the Emirates, for example. There are two really good Reformed churches there. The elders there, the pastors, they've got about I think they've got 8 or 9 pastors, maybe more than that, maybe about 12 actually. Congregation's like 1,000 people. Not one of them is from the same country. They're all from different countries, because Dubai is this weird cosmopolitan metropolis in the middle of Arabia. But they're all from different nations. There's one from America. there's one from Nigeria, there's one from South Africa, there's one from Ethiopia, blah, blah. So the only thing, and the congregation's the same. The congregation is literally a UN convention. And the only thing that actually connects them is the English language. So that kind of kit setting, that's fine, because the common language there for them is English. They actually need to speak English there, because that's the one lingua franca which unites them. That's cool, that's fine. But if it was just a congregation of just Emiratis who speak Arabic, or don't have it in English, have it in Arabic. So that's just something that can even maybe come up in regards to how we do worship. Those kind of things come up too. If I can circle back to one more thing. Here's the big broad point of what's going on here. We have the ritual distinction between Jew and Gentile officially broken down here. Formally and officially. This has been the widely understood interpretation of this across the board. It's the abrogation, fulfillment, in this case, of that ceremonial component of the Levitical law of the Holiness Code, Leviticus 11, which by definition, as I meant, as with the food, so with the people, it therefore breaks down the distinction between the peoples. The Gentiles are no longer unclean, they're no longer unworthy, they're no longer to be kept out of the camp, all those kind of various things which came, right? They're now united, right? What does this do for us? Well, it does, again, this comes up later because this whole chapter is about the Gentiles, broadly speaking. This is the big fundamental demarcation point between the exclusively Jewish ministry that's been thus far into now the opening up to the Gentiles. That's why this entire chapter is about the Gentiles. Now, I can see your eyes thinking, because you may be hearkening back to the Ethiopian eunuch. Yes. Now, this is what...
technically the first Gentile convert.
The question is maybe. Now, this is the point I made back last time. As I said, the part of this exegesis, with chapter 7 or 8, I forget which chapter it is, I think 7, or 8, one or the other. The distinction, or the point that I made back then was part of our exegesis of the Ethiopian eunuch and that story can only be done in reflection or relative to this passage, right? Because they go theologically hand in hand. There's been a multitude of different understandings or interpretations of the identity of the Ethiopian eunuch. I mentioned a couple of them last time, but I'll refresh memory. One is that he is an ethnic Jew in Ethiopia. The other is that he was a proselyte, i.e. a Jewish convert. The other is that he was simply a God-fearer, kind of like Cornelius, so not a Jewish convert, not circumcised. Now, obviously not circumcised by the virtue of the fact that he was a eunuch. So being a proselyte, sorry, not being a proselyte, but being a God-fearer is one that has been a common interpretation. That certainly has legs. I'm not pretending it doesn't have legs to stand on. The other major interpretation has been that he was a Jew in Ethiopia. Now again, we think, a Jew in Ethiopia, but why would there be a Jew in Ethiopia? Well, there's Jews all around. Keep in mind that the Cushites descended from Cush, descended from Noah. Cush, ultimately descended coming out of from Ham. But the Cushites were descended from Noah. These are the peoples that came down into East Africa, into the Sudan and Ethiopia. So what we call the beyond Upper Egypt and the Upper Nile. Even by this point, first century, again, we saw the list of places, and it was just a synopsis of places from all around the Roman Empire and beyond that the Church of Jerusalem was made up of, from Jews who were in Jerusalem for Pentecost. Now the question goes, well, okay, so why was he referred to as an Ethiopian? Because I'll lay down my card. So in light of the different historical interpretations that have occurred from many different theologians, I would personally align with the idea that he was a Jew in Ethiopia. That's my personal theological interpretation. When I say personal, I don't mean like unique to me. I just mean like that's where I land on it. My basis for landing on it is apart from the kind of various commentaries that others have provided in times past, is primarily because the distinction of him being referred to as an Ethiopian does not automatically denote, or connote in this case, him being an ethnic Ethiopian. We have a multitude of examples of ethnic Jews who are referred to as a such and such based on where they were actually from. So like, for example, Simon the Cyrene, right, or Simon the Cyrene, was from Cyrene in North Africa, in what's called Libya. It's like modern day Libya near Benghazi, but he's a Jew. But he's referred to as Simon the Cyrene. Do you see what I mean? Priscilla and Aquila, particularly Aquila, is referred to as having been from Rome, but also been from Pontus. Right? So Pontus was the region on the south of the Black Sea, which was just simply called the Pontic Sea. Pontus is the Greek word for sea, so the sea. The Pontic Sea was just simply referred to as the Pontus, the sea. And Pontus, though, was the region on the kind of southeastern coast of what we today call the Black Sea. So he was originally from there, but he and Priscilla had ended up in Corinth via Rome. They'd been in Rome, and the Jews had been expelled from Rome, right? But he's referred to as being from Pontus, but he's a Jew. Do you see what I mean? So he's referred to from where he's from. He's referred to as being from Pontus, right? Simon the Cyrene is referred to as being from Cyrene, but they're all Jews, though. So simply the distinction of being referred to as an Ethiopian comports or fits with those other references of being referred to from where they're from, even though they're an ethnic Jew. So that's the linguistic component. The second broader component is that in terms of the relative volume of material and the way it's delivered, by comparative standards, the conversion of the Ethiopian eunuch is almost a proverbial blip on the map compared to what essentially is an entire chapter about Cornelius and from Cornelius, the conversion of the Gentiles, right? It involves this vision, it involves this whole distinction of the breaking down of clean and unclean, which comports way better with the context of Cornelius being the first Gentile convert, as opposed to this odd scenario of this being made a massive deal out of, but you already had a Gentile convert a couple of chapters ago. You know what I mean? And keep in mind, a couple of chapters ago is years ago. That's years ago. Like we hop in the DeLorean and travel like 5 years in the space of about 3 sentences back in chapter 8 or 9, whatever it is, with regards to Paul, who goes off in Arabia and it's just mentioned in the next verse. So this is years after the conversion of the Ethiopian eunuch. Him coming to Jerusalem and doing all that fits, well, other way around, a cup for the horse. Him being an ethnic Jew fits with him coming to Jerusalem. Because again, it does, as I'm saying, it's not like the concept of him being a God-fearer like Cornelius, in this case, a Gentile Ethiopian, but coming because he's essentially a proselyte without having been circumcised. It's not like that's some wild interpretation. I'm saying it does have legs. I just simply think that him being ethnically Jewish fits much better, not only with the details of his conversion, but also with its place in the canon of the book of Acts, especially considered the volume of what we're being given here, and this massive fuss being made about Cornelius. But again, differences of opinions have come up. Even just to give you some simple, there's a number of, I can point to historic examples like Irenaeus or Jerome that have held the view I'm holding to here, as well as others. Luther held that he was a Jewish proselyte, and Calvin held that he was a Gentile. I think it was the other way around, actually. Luther held that he was a Gentile. Calvin held that he was a proselyte. So again, differences of opinions. It's not like this is some make or break deal regarding heresy. I would submit, theologically, that the Ethiopian eunuch, in comparison or in light of this chapter, was ethnically Jewish and was referred to as an Ethiopian by virtue of him being in Ethiopia, like Simon the Cyrene, like Aquila, being from Pontus, blah, blah, And it also makes more sense of the literary place of chapter 10. This is a decisive turning point where now we see the Gentiles becoming a big deal. And it makes sense of Cornelius having this big deal made of him by being the first Gentile convert. Certainly the majority of theologians throughout history have held that Cornelius was the first. Again, that's just supplementary evidence. But nevertheless, what's indisputable is that this is a turning point in the history of the church unto the Gentiles. And that makes sense of Cornelius being the first Gentile convert. Again, 40 AD, coming 10 years after this whole thing has begun. So there we are. I'll leave it there, and then next week we continue on from verse 17 onwards. So is there any final questions or comments or anything else of the sort? Yeah.
If Paul the Apostle was a tent maker, and it's probable that he was, how could he work with dead animal skins?
By virtue of, well, it depends. The question of his tent making comes as a matter of when did that begin. So it may have been something that was picked up afterwards, for example.
I have received from many online scholars that wherever he went, whatever city in Greater Rome or Greece he went, he worked as a tent maker because
we get reference to that in Corinth.
On the arms of the churchgoers.
Yeah, exactly. He did that. No, I'm not saying he didn't do it. No, he definitely did that. We get reference to that in Corinth, for example. The question of when he picked up that work, was he doing that back? Like, so let's just say, for example, when we've encountered formerly Saul in the earlier chapters of Acts, was he also doing tent making then? Because that'd be a bit odd.
I understand the family was in tent making, so the answer would be yes.
Yeah, and so yeah. Although with him in the Pharisaical school, that may not have been a direction that he particularly went down. It could have been though. It would explain why he has that background or context to be able to engage in tent making. When he exactly began the tent making, we're not sure.
Maybe he just didn't touch the skins. Maybe the employees did.
May have, and that was not uncommon at all. So there were ways that those kind of workarounds occurred. Yeah. So that would be something that wouldn't be completely historically out of place. Yeah, for sure. But ultimately, we're not really told when he began tent making. We're just told that it was something that he did to supplement income. When he was in Corinth, for example, or so on and so forth. Yeah.
This Bible, which is a one-man job, a one-new-man Bible, the author says that he wasn't a tent maker because the same word can be used for prayer shawl making.
It can be, yep. It can be. And again, like a lot of things regarding language, depends on context.
Interesting.
Context, yeah. Yeah, context.
You can ask him.
Yeah, no, it's the same way how we have words. It's why I mentioned earlier, we hear the words servant and how should that be? How should that be interpreted? Yeah, because doulos can be applied as slave or servant, and so again, that's why hermeneutics is important. Understanding how to interpret given words, Old and New Testament, requires understanding all things, including context. Context determines, applying to Chloe, for example, to Phoebe, gets referred to as a servant, and in modern times, in the last 30, 40 years, there have been those who have wanted to try and interpret that as being a deacon. But again, that's a very novel interpretation. No one in church history has ever interpreted it that way. And so, again, it's what I say all the time. You won't find anyone more devoted to the theology of the sola scriptura than me. The reality that all things in Christian faith and practice must be interpreted in light of Scripture is vitally important. But you'll also hear me very loudly and clearly saying, good luck doing theology without church history. Good luck. Good luck getting a good grasp on the nature of Christ without understanding the Council of Nicaea and Constantinople. Good luck. The church history and the councils and creeds of the church serve as the guardrails of theology that stop us from just flying off the road because we came up with an idea that we think is correct without ever consulting the fact that perhaps maybe the Spirit of God has also worked in and through other people who've come before us, usually who are orders of magnitude smarter. And so, yeah, so under, you know, if I want to understand, how's that word being applied there in regards to her? Well, gee, has anyone thought about this issue before? Oh, well, look, they have. What did they say? Oh, they all said this. Well, there you go. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure it out. Like, it just, how's this been interpreted before? Has there been major controversy? Oh, no controversy at all. Everyone understood what this meant, that it was merely a reference to being the common generic understanding of a servant, not an official office position in the church. But yet we want to come up with novel ideas because we don't care about church history.
Suits the current narrative.
Well, that just reminds me, I never asked you about church history. Last Sunday I was supposed to come up and find out if you'd made up.
Yeah, that's right. So that's the end of this morning's study. Now, onto that issue. A couple of you here are interested anyway, so I might as well mention it. So here's what I'm dialing down. I'm still yet to speak to the O'Mealys. They weren't here on Sunday. But I imagine this would still be fine regarding their timetable. Here's what's basically looking like will work the best, and I think this will be a fairly palatable solution for everyone. At the moment, and again, confirming with you and confirming with others who are interested, the best convergence of time in regards to when people are available and when people are able looks like after our Sunday morning service. Now, when I say after, I don't mean like literally immediately after. I mean, here's the idea that I'll be proposing basically, and I'll propose it to you and you can give me feedback whether it works. At least like in terms of the majority of weeks. Is that, let's just say the service finishes, I'm just going to use round figures, let's just say the service finishes at 11:30. Starting the class an hour or whatever, roughly, after the service ends. So we have an hour for morning tea, which is usually what most people are doing, an hour to an hour 15, whatever it happens to be. Some people like to go longer, but nonetheless. But starting at an hour or an hour 15, whatever happens to be, after the service ends, and it's essentially it's a 12:30, 1 o'clock start. Okay. I haven't encountered anyone yet who consistently has something like immediately after the service or like busy on a Sunday. Most people have seemed to have that time available from what I've gathered thus far. It saves us from doing it before the service, where it doesn't allow any much freedom or movement for questions or other such interactions that people may want to have. And it also doesn't give us the stress of having to have a hard finish on a given time to then get ready for the service. So having that kind of concept, again, roughly of something like it starts, just to use round figures, an hour after the worship service ends, does that sound like a workable idea?
Oh, yeah, it saves me driving twice.
Yeah, now the other part too, it saves also having to come back at some other time, and some other midweek thing.
Might need a more substantial morning tea.
Yes?
Bring a sandwich.
Yeah.
But you probably couldn't do it on the lunch times.
No. So what we would do, is obviously when we have church lunch on the last Sunday, we won't do it then. So it would be like normal months. It'll be 3 weeks out of the 4, and that should work fairly all right. If that's it, I'm getting head nods, which is good. So I'll refer that to others who are also wanting to come. And if there's no impediment there, then that's essentially what we'll be looking at doing. It also gives time to, it gives time to have something to eat. It also maybe gives time to either, I'll talk with our catering staff, but it maybe bring food or enough time, bring a lunch, or enough time to duck home and come, you've got that hour block period, time to duck home, have lunch or bring a lunch, but whatever you want to do. and anything, giving a solid time there to.
And out here or in there?
So the study would be in there because we'll be utilising the screen. Yep. So need the screen for that.
Up in the church.
Yeah, in the church. Yeah. So utilising the screen to allow visualization so people can see the points that are being made, or using a lot of photos or maps or whatever happens to be. That'll be done in there. Yes. And you can have food in there. It's fine to have food in there for that. But yes, nonetheless, that's the idea that we're running with broadly. Is it's not necessarily like, it's always a 12:30 start, because like I said, it's just when does the service end, and we'll start in an hour's time, or whatever I decide, an hour 15, whatever it has to be, right?
Well, we know who the preacher is, and he has to end.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it won't alter. The worship services will obviously still work fine, but then we just simply calculate. So let's just say the service ends at 11:30, or it ends at 11:45 that week. I'm just picking a time. Well, then the Bible. Then the class starts at 12:45.
Yeah.
If it ends at 11:30, it'll start at 12:30. Whatever. It's just so it's a consistent thing. It's still the hour block, and we just time it off of whatever. That seems like the best solution to be able, and it saves people having to make multiple trips. It saves having to tack on another day to try and find free time. Because when I broke it down, like there were people who were available. Best time was Tuesdays. Best time was Wednesdays. Best time was Thursdays. Best time was Friday. It was a smorgasbord. And so Sunday, and now that's the plan. I'll confirm that with others, but nevertheless, that seems like what'll be a decent solution to work with. So it allows people to come in. It also, as importantly, allows us to come into the worship service fresh, if you want to call it that, because there's this will come up in our series on doxology about how we prepare and conduct ourselves during that worship service. That'll be a point that'll be made throughout the series. That's a lot easier to do when you haven't had your head kind of just like force-fed a bomb load of information about Clement of Rome or whatever. So anyway, yes. So that's what we're looking at. Okay. Yep. Good. Alrighty. Thank you very much, everyone.